Alberto Giacometti, you have said that all you want to do is to copy what you see, that what matters to you is likeness, and that this remains your purpose, whether you're making a sculpture or a painting or a drawing. Yet the forms in your sculptures do tend to be decidedly thinner than those in your paintings and drawings.
Yes, but when you do a painting, you create a total illusion of the reality of the appearance of a person in a particular position and a particular environment, and you can't separate the person from that environment. And when you're looking at someone full face, for example, you aren't thinking about what's behind his face. You aren't thinking conceptually. You're thinking visually. There's more illusion involved than when you're working with real volume. With sculpture, in the first place, I'm a slave of tradition because for me, as for everyone else, realistic sculpture that is like a head, means a Greek or Roman head. Even Rodin still took measures when he was making his busts. He started from the conventional idea of a head and made a volume in space unlike anything he actually saw. Because in the ordinary way, it would never occur to me to get up and walk around you. If I didn't know that your skull had a certain depth, I wouldn't be able to guess it. So if I made a sculpture of you according to my absolute perception of you, I would make a rather flat, scarcely modulated sculpture that would be much closer to a Cycladic sculpture, which has a stylized look, than to a sculpture by Rodin, which has a realistic look. I think we have for so long automatically accepted the received idea of what a sculptured head should look like that we have made ourselves completely incapable of seeing a head as we really see it. That's why it has become almost impossible for me to do a head from life. I can't even understand how anyone can do a head from life size, either in painting or in sculpture. When I see a life-size head in a picture by Cézanne, or a head by Rodin or Courbet or Titian or anyone else, I can't conceive how they could have done it. In this respect, the scale of the primitives is much nearer to me, nearer to how I see a head than all the life-size portraits that have been made since.
And heads that are larger than life-size?
If it's larger than life-size, it's outside our domain. It becomes a monumental thing, and then it's made for a particular site, generally a building. If the Egyptians situate sculptures 5 meters high in front of a temple, you only see them as sculpture when you're 40 meters away, so they become small again. Large sculpture is only small sculpture blown up. The key sculptures of any of the ancient civilizations are almost all on a small scale. Whether Egyptian or Sumerian or Chinese or prehistoric, they almost always, more or less, are the same size. And I think that this was the size that instinctively seemed right, the size one really sees things. I can do your head life-size because I know it's life-size. I don't see directly anymore. I see you through my knowledge. Actually, this has always been the case to a greater or lesser degree. For example, my father, who made portraits from life, made life-size portraits quite instinctively, even if I was sitting for him 3 meters away. Once, when I was about 18 or 19, I was in his studio drawing some pears that were on a table at the normal distance for a still life. And the pears kept getting smaller. They kept getting tiny. I'd begin again, and they'd always go back to exactly the same size. My father got irritated and said, "But just do them as they are, as you see them." I tried to do them as he wanted, but I couldn't stop myself from rubbing out. I kept on rubbing out, and a half an hour later, they were exactly the same size to the millimeter as the first ones. Until the war, when I was drawing, I always drew things smaller than I believed I saw them. In other words, when I was drawing, I was amazed that everything became so small. But when I wasn't drawing, I felt I saw heads the size they really were. And then, very gradually, and especially since the war, it has become so much a part of my nature, so ingrained that the way I see when I'm working persists even when I'm not working. I can no longer get a figure back to life size.
Francis Bacon, can you say why photographs interest you so much?
Well, I think one's sense of appearance is assaulted all the time by photography and by film. So that when one looks at something, one's not only looking at it directly, but one's also looking at it through the assault that has already been made on one by photography and film. And 99% of the time, I find that photographs are very much more interesting than either abstract or figurative painting. I've always been haunted by them.
Do you know what it is especially that haunts you about them? Is it their immediacy? Is it the surprising shapes that happen in them? Is it their texture?
I think it's the slight remove from fact, which returns me onto the fact more violently. Through the photographic image, I find myself beginning to wander into the image and unlock what I think of as its reality more than I can by looking at it. And photographs are not only points of reference, they're often triggers of ideas.
The influence, though, tends to be oblique. For instance, in that you'll often, while painting, be looking at a photograph of something quite other than the subject you're painting.
I think you've said somewhere that while you were sitting for a portrait I was trying to do of you, I was always looking at photographs of wild animals.
Yes, I never knew quite how to take that.
Well, one image can be deeply suggestive in relation to another. I had an idea in those days that textures should be very much thicker, and therefore the texture of, for instance, a rhinoceros skin would help me think about the texture of a human skin.
It's interesting that the photographic image you've worked from most of all isn't a scientific or a journalistic one, but a very deliberate and famous work of art. The Still of the Screaming Nanny from Potemkin.
It was a film I saw almost before I started to paint, and it deeply impressed me. I did hope at one time to make, it hasn't any special psychological significance, I did hope one day to make the best painting of the human cry. It never worked out, though.
You've used the Eisenstein image as a constant basis, and you've done the same with the Velázquez Innocent X, and entirely through photographs and reproductions of it. Is there a great deal of difference between working from a photograph of a painting and from a photograph of reality?
Well, with a painting, it's an easier thing to do because the problem's already been solved. The problem that you're setting up, of course, is another problem. I don't think that any of these things that I've done from other paintings actually have ever worked.
Not even any of the versions of the Velázquez Pope?
I've always thought this was one of the greatest paintings in the world, and I've used it through obsession. And I've tried very, very unsuccessfully to do certain records of it, distorted records. I regret them because I think they're very silly. I think that this thing was an absolute thing that was done, and nothing more can be done about it.
You've stopped painting them now, have you?
I have.
I want to ask whether your love of photographs makes you like reproductions as such. I mean, I've always had a suspicion that you're more stimulated by looking at reproductions of Velázquez or Rembrandt than at the originals.
Well, of course, it's easier to pick them up in your own room than take the journey to the National Gallery. But I do, nevertheless, go a great deal to look at them in the National Gallery because I want to see the color, for one thing. But if I'd got Rembrandts here all around the room, I wouldn't go to the National Gallery.
You'd like to have Rembrandts around the room?
I would. There are very few paintings I would like to have, but I would like to have Rembrandts.
Yet when you finally went to Rome, I think you didn't take the opportunity to see Innocent X.
I didn't, no. It's true to say that at that time I was extremely unhappy emotionally. And though I loathed churches, I spent most of my time in St. Peter's just wandering around. But I think another thing was probably a fear of seeing the reality of the Velázquez after my tampering with it, seeing this marvelous painting and thinking of the stupid things one had done with it.